In going from 2 to 2.5 million years ago, until the development of agriculture, the human brain increased in size threefold. From that time, the development of agriculture until today, the human brain has actually shrunken by about 10%. Now, that's correlative information. Does it mean that the sudden dietary shift is the cause of that? Well, I'm allowed to say I think so because I do think so. I think it's also responsible for our well-documented decrease in bone density, in the sudden increase in poor dentition. When you look at fossils from long, long ago, of ancestors from 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, they have beautiful teeth. Now our fossils, of course, are going to show all these restorations and you name it, but I think that's sort of a surrogate marker for health. It's certainly a surrogate marker for the diversity of the oral microbiome.
Hey friends, welcome back. It's episode number 253 with Dr. David Perlmutter. This is part 2. Okay, so I say part 2 because 2 years ago he came on and we talked a lot about the ketogenic diet, fasting, and the correlations between aberrant glucose metabolism and poor cognitive outcome and dementia and Alzheimer's and things along those lines. So today we kind of pick up where we left off. Particularly what I think is super exciting that I think you'll enjoy. I'll put the timestamp right here. And it's this notion that our gut bacteria, researchers at University of Louisville, have figured out that our microbiome can basically assimilate and absorb some of the nuclear material, the plant RNA, contained within exosomes. And I think it may sound a little complicated at first, but it speaks to food quality. We're going to talk about the importance of grass-fed meat and so forth in just a minute. But that to me is a game changer. And I think it's something that we all need to consider. We're going to talk a lot about where our food comes from, the importance of whole real foods, and of course, intermittent fasting and different feeding strategies in this discussion. And towards the end, I picked Dr. Perlmutter's brain about his personal strategies to improve novelty, to incorporate novelty, and how he is able to maintain a high level of productivity throughout his career. So we get a little bit personal, but it's a great discussion brought to you by our friends over at ButcherBox.com. As a new member, you can save $20 off your first order, but go into ButcherBox.com/HIH. Now here's why I like ButcherBox.com, and so does Dr. Perlmutter. In fact, when I was there that day, literally his order had just arrived a little bit before I got there. So what's unique about ButcherBox is they're supplying truly 100% pasture-raised, grass-fed, and antibiotic-free cattle products, heritage bred, and antibiotic-free and pasture-raised pork products. The same with the chicken products. Now, it's really important to keep in mind food quality, particularly when it comes to animal products, guys, because remember, animal products usually, eat grains, and a lot of those grains are genetically modified. So if their gut is sick from the grains they shouldn't be eating, then how can you expect to be healthy if you're eating animals that are fed the unhealthy things that make us unhealthy, right? It just doesn't make sense to me how some people, rationalize that. So that's why I do like ButcherBox. You're never ever going to get feedlot cattle, only truly pasture-raised, grass-fed, grass-finished cattle that are out roaming pastures. So again, you can save $20 off your next order by going to butcherbox.com/HIH-2. I'll put a link right here and a link below. It's a great promotion going on, guys. And as I mentioned, some of these promotions don't last forever, so I would suggest you act now. Now, of course, we're going to get back into it with Dr. Perlmutter in just a minute, but his updated and revised version of Grain Brain is out now. I would definitely suggest checking it out, especially if you didn't read part 1, because there's a ton of new science in there that you should be aware about. And especially, this time of year, we're going to be with our relatives, people we care about. They still need to understand that fats are not bad. You don't have to have a bagel and a glass of orange juice to have a healthy breakfast. You can either skip breakfast or have eggs that are high in cholesterol. He's going to talk a little bit about how cholesterol intake is correlated with improved protection against things like dementia and Alzheimer's and things along those lines. So let's get back to it with Dr. David Perlmutter. Dr. P, great to be with you again.
Good to see you.
Here in Naples?
Yeah.
Now, did you grow up in Florida?
I did. I do. I was born in Coral Gables and still here.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. We had a worrisome year with red tide, so we don't know where that's going to go.
Interesting. And that's, what is it, the organophosphates being used? Is that the theory?
No one really knows. That's one idea. I think lawn fertilizer may be playing a role. It's a natural event, so it's been occurring since recorded first middle of the 1500s when Spanish conquistadors first came here. And so it's been around a long time, but we've never had a solid year without a break.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And as a steward, I mean, a sailor, you're a sailor, right? Or what do you call it? Boat?
Well, we were boaters.
Boaters, okay. Do you sail too?
Well, we haven't for a long time.
Yeah.
We powerboat.
Nice.
But very slowly, not much fuel.
That's amazing. And so this summer you're going to go up towards Alaska and so forth. And
we are going to go on the Inland Passage to Juneau.
Nice.
And look at the glaciers and just really have a great experience.
That's awesome. Do you fish when you're out there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we do almost every day. Fish, crab, prawn.
Great.
Yeah.
What vegetables do you bring with you, or any?
It's a terrific question. So we have generally arranged thus far to have vegetables delivered to various places along the way, organic, that were flown up from Vancouver, not expensive. And these are flights that are normally occurring. So we arrange for the health food store to deliver organic vegetables to the airplane. And then there's a box with Perlmutter written on it.
So cool.
It's great. Because that and getting enough aerobic exercise are the big challenges.
That you face. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could do push-ups and a few.
Well, we got a stepper.
Oh, there you go.
And that works. And then we're kayaking a lot too.
Yeah.
So we did great last year.
Since we spoke last time, and I'll put a link to the video here for everyone listening right now, there's been a lot of trends that have emerged and so forth. The carnivorous diet, I'm curious about your thoughts as a microbiome enthusiast. There's a lot of people out there just eating meat-only diets, okay? And to that point, some people are getting great results with autoimmunity and allergies. What are your thoughts as someone who studies the microbiome quite extensively for long-term health, brain health, and a carnivorous diet?
I'd say that I think people have kind of gravitated towards that, thinking that is as paleo as you can be. And the truth of the matter is it's unlikely that's what our ancestors did. They weren't predominantly eating meat all the time or animal products. And, certainly I have been accused in writing Grain Brain of being sort of like an Atkins redux, meaning just, stick with the bacon and dairy products and you'll be fine. And that's not, in my opinion, the way to cultivate a good gut microbiome. I think we've got to nurture the gut with a lot of plant-based foods, a lot of fiber, for example, and less and less animal product. Now that sounds a bit in contrast to our previous messaging, and that's cool because we really want messaging to evolve with time.
Totally.
I think that there is, by definition, no fiber in any animal product. And fiber is probably the most underrated and of the most valuable food choices that you can make. So to relegate meat to being the garnish on the side is reasonable and I think a very good idea. In fact, it's what we've always advocated, though people have always said, the Grain Brain diet, that's just eating pork rinds all day. And even beyond that, there's a new book out called OMD, One Meal a Day. The author is named Cameron, and she talks about if you can devote one meal a day to going plant-based, it's a really good start. So we are definitely advocates of that choice for multiple reasons.
Is it more the fiber? Is it the polyphenols and micronutrients, the phytonutrients? What about it, plants, gets you very excited?
All of the above. And I think even more exciting was, we've been trying to connect these dots between our food and the changes that you mentioned in the gut microbiota. Yeah. Changes in their metabolic activity, changes in their reproduction, and even changes in their location, where the gut bacteria choose to live. We know that gut bacteria are fundamental for maintenance of the gut lining, so the mobilization of these organisms to the lining of the gut where they can do their job in terms of maintenance and repair, I think is really very fundamental. Yeah. But we've seen the research that has linked higher fiber to good things happening in the gut bacteria. The role of fat, the role of sugar, the role of carbs, et cetera, have all been looked at. But the real powerful connection of the dots in terms of mechanisms that might change the bacteria has just very recently been revealed in research by a Dr. Tang, University of Louisville, that really helps mechanistically our understanding of what food, which we know is actually information, does to gut microbiome. And what he demonstrated was that exosomes, or these small encapsulated particles from the cells of plants contain plant RNA. Those exosomes are released during the course of digestion and then are incorporated into bacteria and influence their RNA expression. And that's a game changer, because that influences, again, the location of those organisms, where they, what they're doing in terms of their metabolic production, and even their desire or not to reproduce. So the levels of various groups of bacteria or individually are changed based upon our foods, which we know. But now we have the mechanism, and that's, I don't know, I get excited
totally.
about it.
I'm smiling right now.
I'm glad you're smiling.
Yeah.
Not everybody gets turned on by that
Yeah.
information, but I think it's very relevant, very important, because it opens the door for us to understand now how can we look at the genome of the plant and compare that to what we are seeing expressed in the bacterial organisms. And it also, in thinking about it, as I was falling asleep one night, I thought, well, that's interesting. How might that relate to the notion of genetically modifying the genome of the plant? Knowing now that there's this connection between the plant genome and the bacterial genome, and we know there's a connection between the bacterial genome and our genome. So this then connects two very important dots, genetically modifying the plant seed, and therefore the plant, and then what that's doing to our DNA.
It's frightening to think about. That was my follow-up question, because like the BT toxin or whatever, it's spliced in. So if the microbes are internalizing that, and then what metabolic processes are they going to upregulate or downregulate or whatever? Frightening.
Well, let's just talk about that for a second. So what you're talking about is the BT toxin, Bacteria thuringiensis israelii, and that is the modification that allows the production of a product that will basically rip open the intestines of potential pests that are going to eat the crop, right? But that said, there is work, and Jeffrey Smith, who's done really a lot to publicize this, talks about how it's not just confined to the pests, but that may have an effect in humans. So the BT toxin story, I think, is alive and well. And similarly, we're now seeing a lot more data come to us that looks at what does a vegetarian diet look like in terms of the microbiome, and more important, well, not more importantly, but certainly more exciting for me, for perhaps you, I would think, is the changes that are seen in the microbiome in response to a ketogenic diet. And I think those are adaptive kinds of changes that are imparted by virtue of the fact that the diet has been instituted, that I think ultimately are going to prove a couple of things. First, I think it's going to validate the notion, the long-held notion, that we in our ancestry were in fact in ketosis. Some of the time, most of the time, who knows, I think significantly. And therefore, that relationship to these changes that are now being demonstrated in the microbiome showed how the relationship could work, or did work, to keep us healthy. And that's an experiment that's a research study going on now for 2.5 million years or so. And I think it's a heck of a track record.
That's such a great point. In our last interview, some people did comment, and they said, how does Dr. Perlmutter know that our ancestors were or weren't in ketosis? And what would you say to that? I mean, part of it is like just food availability. Naturally, through fasting, it would lend itself to being in a more fat-adapted ketogenic state.
Without a doubt. I mean, truthfully, everybody's in some grade of ketosis before you have breakfast in the morning. So you are fasting since you had your evening meal. And if you don't have your breakfast until today mine was just before a phone call, so at 2 o'clock, I had a salad with some eggs in it, and that was when I had my break fast. I broke my fast, and I know I was in ketosis. A number of reasons I can tell you I was, but beyond that, generally I'm able to check my ketones and blood sugar at the same time. I run a blood sugar in the mid to upper 60s, and my ketones around 0.7 beta hydroxybutyrate. So I know that, and I think it's good for people to get that level of understanding in terms of what it takes for them to get to a level where, choose the level that they think is going to be best for them. And so I don't know that our ancestors were in ketosis. They may have had bread long before agriculture. I think it's unlikely. But just based upon the fact that they didn't have access to refined carbohydrates, They didn't have access to really any carbohydrates except for fiber that they might find, or ripened fruit at a particular time of the year, the late summer, early fall. So what could have kept them out of ketosis? That would be the part I would challenge anybody who wanted some justification for that statement to come up with. So as we see what the ketogenic diet is doing mechanistically, and we've talked about this before,
Sure.
Those things all line up to pave the way for survival. We've got a 2.5 million year record now that shows that seems to be working. What's challenging that now in just the past day of our existence is really the sudden shift in the human diet that happened just in a blink of an eye, 10 to 12,000 years ago. Suddenly, we changed to a diet that was favoring carbohydrate. Why? Because these grains that we learned about in our development of agriculture were portable, they were storable, and this allowed us to explore the world and do all the great things that humans have done. That's the narrative that we'd like to believe in. The true narrative is it, for the very first time, represented a dramatic shift in information. So suddenly, we changed the tables on the relationship we have with our own DNA and with the microbes that live within us. Suddenly, we send them a signal the likes of which they've never seen before. Right. And what happened? Well, in going from 2 to 2.5 million years ago, until the development of agriculture, the human brain increased in size threefold. From that time, the development of agriculture until today, the human brain has actually shrunken by about 10%. Now, that's correlative information. Does it mean that the sudden dietary shift is the cause of that? Well, I'm allowed to say I think so because I do think so. I think it's also responsible for our well-documented decrease in bone density, in the sudden increase in poor dentition. When you look at fossils from long, long ago, of ancestors from 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, they have beautiful teeth. And now our fossils, of course, are going to show all these restorations and you name it. But I think that's sort of a surrogate marker for health. It's certainly a surrogate marker for the diversity of the oral microbiome.
Great, excellent point. And I'm glad you kind of brought up the anthropology of it, because people do talk about this. Without wheat, my father-in-law, great man, he studies history and so forth, and it's like, Mike, without wheat, you wouldn't be here right now because it enabled all this growth and proliferation. But you're talking about this trajectory of brain size was going one way, and now it's kind of plateaued, or even it's on its nadir or going down. But what if you, because I know you interviewed Dr. John Douillard, chiropractor in Colorado, and he has this perception that, and some decent data, I guess, that if you were to have wheat in season, prepared properly, in moderation, that it might not be so bad. So what's your thoughts when that comes to the...
Well, so you mentioned an interview I had with John Douillard.
Yeah.
And it turns out, as fate would have it, that we have known him for maybe 25 years. So years ago, he was teaching an Ayurvedic course, and we got to know each other then, and we've made in loose contact over the years. So he wrote a book that's saying that maybe we're given gluten the bad rap, and really we should eat gluten, or in season, as you well mentioned. And so I decided I would interview him. We had very opposing views. We each listened to the other, and the comments after the blog was posted said, how can people who have such opposing views have a normal conversation, a respectful conversation? Because we did. And it was a beautiful thing. I mean, we left at the end. I think he brought up some interesting points, and he, heard my points as well. And it was great. I mean, the comment was, why can't people communicate in that way and stop and listen to the other side, even if they don't agree with it? Right. I mean, I don't know, but maybe the world is flat. Maybe I'm not a necessarily believer in that. Right. But if you are a flat earth person and you sit me down and say, I want to spend some time and tell you what my point of view is, I definitely should listen to that. I mean, I don't know how far you'll get, but that's what's missing in the world today. Yeah, they're normalcy, they're used to American politics probably, and are looking at Fox News or whatever. Polarized. And dig in your heels and operate from the amygdala don't bring online your prefrontal cortex, which allows you to visualize a situation through the perspective of another individual. That's what the beautiful prefrontal cortex, our anatomical gift in addition to the opposable thumb, that's what our gifts are. And that allows us to take visualize the position of another individual, be empathetic, be compassionate, and also understand the consequences of our actions in terms of what it will do in the future, as opposed to impulsivity, where we act from the amygdala and we tweet or whatever we do in immediate response without any thought.
Yeah, great point on communication. A lesson for a lot of people. And in this instant economy with Amazon Prime and all that, we want to get our emotions out oftentimes. But we're deviating a little bit. So getting back to, you prefer your glucose to be like around 70.
Well, I mean, that for me, I'm perfectly fine. 70 is fine. But I mean, for a lot of people, I would say even upper 80s is a reasonable goal, because if they've been doing this, getting into ketosis, you don't want them going down to the mid 60s or 70s. They're not going to tolerate that. But ultimately, it depends on what their insulin situation is. But and I'm not going to say lower is better.
Right.
I've learned not to say that. I mean, I used to say insulin, for example, lower is better. We now know that in a Danish study that went on for 30 years, that women, it was a women's study, showed that those at the very lowest level of insulin in the beginning of the study 30 years ago, had a higher risk of developing dementia, as we would expect with those at the higher end of the curve. So we're appreciating what's called the U-shaped curve, where there is, dare I say, the sweet spot in the middle.
Very interesting. And kind of the reason why I was asking that aspect of the question is that one of the main mechanisms through which consumption of grains and processed carbohydrates in general derived from grains, wheat products and so forth, is the main deleterious health effects coming from the spike in insulin and blood glucose that it's affecting the brain? Or is there, now I'm sure you're going to talk about in the book Grain Brain Revised, that there's other mechanisms as well? But
yeah, I mean, I don't know what the main mechanism is. I mean, to simplify it, you're eating a lot of refined carbs. And we can talk, you could write a book about why that's not in your interest, right?
Yeah.
And I think people pretty well get that. And where does that lead? It leads to increased levels of resistance in terms of the hormone insulin and the downstream effects of that, and specifically how insulin plays a huge role in the health and functionality of the brain. So if you're blocking that activity, that has consequence. But beyond that, this is a diet that's not going to nurture your microbiome either. We talked about that earlier, how when you refine these grains, you're refining out fiber, and you are not allowing those RNA signals that we talked about a moment ago to be transmitted, and in terms of polyphenols and other plant-based nutrients that are not only good for you, but are nurturing your gut bacteria and letting them detox your body, for example. So it's it's not just a question of what's the bad of eating this. It's also the idea of, if you're eating this, then you're not likely eating that. That's like your activity. If you're doing this, you're not doing that. So if you're basing your diet on grains, then likely you're not going to get as much dark leafy green vegetables, colorful vegetables, above ground vegetables, and the most important thing, variety.
Such a great point. I like that mindset shift, right? Like if you're playing video games, you're not reading books.
Exactly right.
So it's a great way to frame it so people can understand. Because when you say, "Oh, that's bad," sometimes people reject and rebel, and all that sort of thing.
I want to say, if you say that's bad, I'd like to know where that comes from. Not that just it's a visceral response. Oh, that's bad, or there is climate change, or there's not climate change. Okay, tell me why you think that.
Yeah, love that point. So what else in grains? The glyphosate residues. Do we know much more about that? And
well, every day we learn a little bit more,
Yeah.
and people think, well, because wheat by and large is not genetically modified, then it takes us out of the conversation of glyphosate. Well, nothing is further from the truth. Most wheat in America is sprayed with an herbicide called glyphosate. That is devastating, according to Dr. Stephanie Seneff and others, on the health and the diversity of the bacteria living within you when you consume that. It alters the microbiome of the cattle that are fed these grains, and so their health is compromised. They will need more antibiotics, which stimulates their growth anyway. There's a movement in America to limit the use of antibiotics in cattle unless the cattle is sick. Well, you're making the cattle sick by virtue of what you're feeding them, so bring on the antibiotics, nothing changes.
Yeah, interesting. So do you get grass-fed meat or do you prefer fish, like as your protein source?
We do have some grass-fed meat and some free-range chicken and wild fish, but we're moving more and more towards being totally plant-based.
I see.
Yep.
And your protein sources would come from like raw and sprouted nuts and seeds and eggs and things like
Absolutely.
that? Or?
So eggs are not, we obviously not vegetarian,
Right.
but I think eggs are underrated and really, eggs have a lot of a great chemical that I think is really helpful, and that is cholesterol. Bring on the cholesterol. We need that. But it doesn't mean at this stage we're not going to have some grass-fed beef or free-range chicken. But I think the more we go towards plant-based, the better.
From a health standpoint, philosophical standpoint?
Both.
Okay. Yeah, it is tough to...
I did my best over the years to argue away the idea that raising cattle was this major environmental threat, and I think it's probably not as big a threat as people who are devoted to vegetarianism perhaps would like us to believe. But I think hearing their side of the story begins to make some sense. And again, I've changed. My family, my wife and I and our children have changed moving forward, and that's a good thing. So the messaging has changed. If people had read things I had written many, many years ago when I was fully vegetarian, then we embraced grass-fed beef, etc. But I think that people should embrace the notion that change coming from people like myself who get out there and make our ideas known, the messaging being changed with time is a good thing. It should be welcomed. And it's not like I'm going to take a position that I held 15 years ago and do everything I can, despite current science, to defend that position. I don't think that serves anybody, and I think it doesn't help move the ball down the field.
I've been thinking about this so much. As influencers, it seems like they participate unknowingly or unconsciously in the sunk cost bias. Like they promoted an all meat diet or an all this diet, and then they just continue to defend it. But you're saying, and I like that. I think people respect it, that it's okay to say I'm changing my mind, or I've opened up ideas to new, I'm open to new concepts and paradigms. So
that's what it means to be human. When you end up giving that up, you've given up your gift to question and make progress, to change in midstream. I mean, when you suddenly lock in and that's what you're going to say and do the rest of your life, then you're not available for new information. And that won't work for me. Maybe it would work for the other guy.
I don't think I think people will appreciate that and respect it. And I think people should change. And going back a little bit to keto, I didn't want to interrupt you. You were talking about in-season fruits and vegetables. Do you think that for the Homo sapiens that are metabolically healthy, not obese, don't have autoimmunity and diabetes?
In other words, a small number of people.
Yeah, very small number. Yeah, that recent report, was it at Penn State, I believe, that showed that like 80% of Americans are overweight or they're metabolically inflexible.
Compromised.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
And it's only getting worse. And interestingly, I looked at a graph just last night.
Yeah. And
it showed, it plotted on one axis overall average weight, and on the other graph, the same axis, it showed carbohydrates consumed. And interestingly, the weight continues to rise over the past 10 years, while there's been a leveling off and actually a decline in the carbohydrate. Well, what gives? If everything we've been talking about really makes sense in terms of weight loss, what's happening? And I think the explanation that hit me as soon as I saw the graph was, this is the manifestation of the major shifts that happened in the microbiome while people were eating higher levels of simple carbohydrates. And in addition, the use of artificial sweeteners, which are not considered carbs, right? So you may have a low carb diet and use artificial sweeteners, and you dramatically compromise the health of your microbiome and open the door for diabetes. So the data shows that while you might drink sugar-sweetened beverages, if you drink unsweetened or artificially sweetened beverages, using things like aspartame, your risk of diabetes is greater than if you drank the regular soda.
Gosh, that's so counter to what most people think. They think it's kind of like it's a wash. If I get the Coke Zero, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything to me. So there is that research on the microbiome, aspartame and sucralose and so forth. But also, if we know we have taste receptors in the tongue and the heart throughout the body. So if your brain is sensing sweet coming in, do you think there's an insulin response or a metabolic response?
I absolutely do. And what is sweet telling you? When you suddenly taste sweet, it's telling you that winter's coming. It's saying, get ready, the fruit is ripe. That's the signal from nature. Mm-hmm. Those blueberries that you found are ripe. Better eat them, and we'll change your microbiome as well, getting ready. We're going to shift your microbiome to one that senses caloric scarcity. So you'll hold on to every precious calorie you can. You'll build body fat. You will inhibit lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat. You will stimulate lipogenesis. You'll make more fat. So these are signaling mechanisms that are as old as we are. And suddenly, as I mentioned just yesterday, we have turned the tables on these messages that our environment gives us, such that we think winter is coming 365 days a year. So we're storing body fat. We are changing our microbiomes to extract more calories from the very food that we eat. We're painting ourselves into a box. And it's why we see this graph that shows continuing weight gain, although carb consumption, it's not that simple. Some of the people say, look, you see?
You keto people are wrong the whole time.
You're eating less carbs, and yet people are still getting fatter and fatter. It's a more complex story. You involve the microbiome. You involve cell signaling. You involve
circadian rhythms, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And that's a huge player. You talk about increasing risk for insulin resistance. Just leave a light on in your bedroom at night, and that will increase your risk for higher levels of insulin resistance.
I can't just leave the TV on all night?
Sure. Just wear your amber glasses. You'll be fine.
Oh, man, this is amazing. So I have seen some of that research, at least in hibernating animals, how their microbiome changes with times in the season. Yeah. So this is really profound. I've never heard it articulating that way, and my metabolic cogs in my brain are going off. So the changes in the microbiome because sweet is coming, because historically to humans, availability of sweets was only during a finite period of time during the year. Wow. Very profound.
Things were ripe.
Yeah.
And we ate those things that were ripe because they had the highest level of phytonutrients. It told us winter is coming, so we stored body fat. And from the plant's perspective, that's when the seed needed to be spread. Everybody wins.
Totally. Okay, that being said, you're in South America in August, or let's just say Mexico, right? So you're north of the equator and so forth.
Good question.
Things are in season, pineapple, mango, papaya, whatever. Okay, it's in the fall. Are you gonna eat some of those compounds?
Yeah, I don't find it's truly totally available that you can eat in season and in location all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to take a step back and look at the broader pictures in terms of trying to override these systems, eating lower carb, lower refined carbohydrate, higher levels of fiber, and really welcoming fat back to the table.
That's awesome.
That's just trying to unwind what we've been what's been inculcated into our minds for decades. And it is unlike anything humans have ever eaten. So I think what you hear me saying is I'm challenging all the accolades for the agricultural revolution. It has destroyed our planet.
Yeah.
It has created a mindset of greed and self-centeredness, of narcissism. We know that higher blood sugars, as a consequence of eating the very foods that the agricultural revolution has provided us, higher blood sugars tend to modify our proteins called glycation, increasing inflammation, and higher levels of inflammatory chemicals inhibit the connection between your primitive, immediate satisfaction brain center and the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to be thoughtful. So that communication is compromised. So your behavior is dictated by the foods you eat to be self-centered, narcissistic, in other words, and impulsive, and not give thought to your neighbor and his or her feelings, or to the future consequences of what you do today. It's purely instantaneous gratification, instantaneous response. So we know that if we engage in activities that are involved in gratitude and empathy, we can strengthen that pathway and regain that pathway. If we reduce inflammation by eating less carbohydrates and more healing fats. I mean, there used to be a time when you would never say healing fat. What could be healing about that? That is good for that connection from our primitive reptilian brain to the prefrontal cortex. And so it's recoverable. So everything we do influences how we see the world through neuroplasticity. So we say that, yes, our thoughts control our actions. We know that. But to a very important degree, our actions will then control our thoughts. What we choose to do will mold and sculpt our brains to be more empathetic, more involved in thinking about the consequences of our actions, for example.
So is that why we see more crime in cities where there's no organic food and it's a lot of fast food and things like that, potentially?
It plays a role. But the other thing is, being distanced from nature. Nature connectedness is really very valuable in terms of increasing empathy, increasing concern for the environment. So nature connectedness might be simply having a plant in your office, not a plastic one,
right?
A real one.
Which is valid. Yeah, I see a lot of plants around here, which is so
Everywhere.
amazing. Behind us too, yeah, and that's why we have the green in the background. Yeah, just, it's funny, the Shinrin-Roku research, if you look at some of that, just having people go to like an urban park in downtown Chicago, it affects like cortisol signaling and T helper cell cytokine release and all
That's
this.
right.
It's so amazing. And so many people just don't value that. Like on the weekends, you guys hike and you get outside. A lot of people, they go to Costco, they buy the healthy food, but they're not making the other lifestyle sweeping changes. So that and your...
Well, you do the best you can.
Yeah.
But getting back to the Shinrin-Yoku idea of nature bathing, I mean, it's well beyond, offloading stress. It is improving insulin sensitivity. It's lowering cortisol as a consequence of offloading stress. And as you mentioned, having a measurable effect on immune reactivity. So we've always been connected. And when we're out in nature, we are breathing in microbes that are associated with trees, and it is the experience that emulates everything that came before us.
That's a beautiful, beautiful point. So just to summarize for everyone listening right now, again, eating fast food and junk food and processed carbohydrates, things like that affect your blood sugar, that's going to kind of take the prefrontal cortex more offline. Stimulate the limbic, fight or flight, impulsive, I need this now.
And look around. Look what's happening in the world. That has a huge impact. Fragmented sleep. I mean, in sleeping that's in a way that's not restorative. And how do you bring that about? Well, you lower your melatonin in the evening. How do you do that? Blue light. Where does that come from? Your iPhone, your Android phone. I don't mean to pick on iPhone. People just sort of say your iPhone these days. Your television. Sources of blue light dramatically reduce melatonin. You're not getting restorative sleep. And what does that do? Yes, that is associated with compromised connection to your prefrontal cortex, but in addition amplifies insulin resistance, and that paves the way for everything bad you don't want to get.
Yeah, such a good point. I mean, just traveling to different time zones, even if you do a lot of things right, it pushes my glucose up. I used to wear a continuous glucose monitor. It was amazing seeing the insights.
Yeah. Any stress can do that. Ultimately, some of that stress may prove to be good for you, though. We call that hormesis. So stressing yourself by missing a night's sleep, for example, actually raises brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I'd like not to say that to you, but it's the truth. But I think, speaking of sleep, it's so undervalued in our society. Our society is geared at these benchmarks of accomplishment that can only be achieved by spending long hours doing something to reach a goal, right? Yeah. And it's not a question of working long, it's a question of working hard, working in a smart way, in a directed way.
Yeah, really good point. All right, so we talked about eating seasonally, eating fruit that's in season in the fall and so forth, in like Mexico, for example. What about if you're in Italy? Are you gonna have any traditionally prepared bread of any sort or any pasta, things like that? Do you think, because some people do, I've heard this from doctors as a former sales rep, doctors would say, my patients went to Italy or they went to Greece, they had all this gluten and wheat and they felt fine. What would be kind of the caveats people should think about?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people who say that might well be people who may not have had problems with gluten or wheat in the first place, or that they recognized.
Yeah.
Having said that, the science would tell us there are a lot of people around who are going to have some degree of reaction to gluten, specifically gliadin, in terms of increased gut permeability, wherever it comes from, whether it comes from Azerbaijan or Italy, or it comes from having lunch at at their neighborhood fast food store. So I hear the same things about people going to Italy, and I think to some degree it's unfair to isolate out the pasta/carbohydrate gluten experience from other things that you might be experiencing while you're there as well. You're having a lot of tomato sauce, you're getting a lot of lycopene and other antioxidants. The vegetables, at least out of the cities, are really, really good, and you tend to eat more of those. You tend to eat more olive oil, so you tend to be getting a lot higher levels of good fats. So on the one hand, you might be consuming foods that are threatening to your gut integrity, specifically the gut lining integrity, while on the other hand, you might be counteracting that by the other positive aspects of what you're experiencing.
Great point. You mentioned olives and olive oil. That's one of my kind of most underrated ketogenic food is eating olives. Like if people are like, they go to like the keto bar or keto shake, but olives, I mean, they're just jam-packed with good fat, polyphenols.
Yeah, I got my box from Walter Longo of the fasting mimicking diet. And every day there's a little package of actual olives, not olive oil, actual olives. And they're great. I think olives are also underrated in terms of being able to travel with them along with hard-boiled eggs, etc. So olives and olive oil, I mean, I just think you can't get enough. I mean, I probably drink at least a liter of olive oil a week.
Wow. Yeah. How do you know it's from Greece or like not cut with things? Is there a brand that you look for?
We're really specific. So we have several brands that we know we've been to where they grow the olives. And you never know for sure. I think a great technology would be a home olive oil tester that could find the canola oil or the other adulterants and let you know. But you bring up a really good point, and that is, by and large, a lot of the olive oil here in America isn't as advertised, especially in restaurants, even high-end restaurants. You can taste it. That slipperiness from the canola, you could taste that in a heartbeat or feel it.
Yeah. And how do you try to avoid canola at all costs?
I do.
Yeah. Because of its affecting some
Well,
membranes?
I mean, I think that much of the canola oil that is out there is created in a way, in terms of its extraction and its temperature treatment, that is, it's not necessarily good food. And, certainly plenty of the canola is genetically modified. So just consuming it, even if you don't buy into the fact that that's a risk, you're supporting GMO.
Which is not good philosophically or the environment, right?
In my opinion, yes. I mean, I did an interview with somebody yesterday, and the moment we said GMO, he went really ballistic, saying, "Oh, it's the most horrible thing." And I was so tempted to ask him why. Why do you think that? And the truth of the matter is, there's no real good, solid data that shows that consuming genetically modified food derived from genetically modified seeds, in and of itself, is specifically threatening. What it does show is the second level relationship of GMO foods are modified to make them Roundup resistant, so we can spray them with glyphosate. Then that food has glyphosate on it, and we know that's bad. So it's one step removed. But now that we get back to what I mentioned earlier, that research by Dr. Teng, that we understand that genes from plant cells actually get into our bodies and get into our bacteria, that raises the level of suspicion to a much higher level.
Absolutely. I've read some research too about absorbing the mRNA from plants as well, and we can do that. So what about on the flip side? So that's the plant side. What about on the animal side? You have a stressed out animal that was in a feedlot in an unnatural environment. You're absorbing maybe that mRNA or those exosomes. What is that doing to the human that's consuming it?
I think it's probably bad. We know that eating that type of food is bad for you. And now I think the question is, well, why is it? I mean, is it the antibiotics that changes the microbiome? Is it the stress chemicals at the time of their death? Is it changes in their DNA that may be transmitted to you? I don't know. But when you read books like the China study, for example, where Dr. Campbell is very adamant in castigating the consumption of red meat, it comes from, by and large, the type of red meat that people consume, and therefore those people who are part of the research studies that he quotes have higher risk of colorectal cancer, for example. Do I believe that? You bet I do. I absolutely do. So nothing magical happens when you add dangerous components it to the cow food, and suddenly it's not alchemy. It doesn't create good things out of it. It's threatening when it went in. It's threatening when it went out.
That's a really good point. You mentioned that you like to eat eggs, as do I. We have backyard chickens and all that sort of stuff. When you're cooking, do you use olive oil or butter?
I guess we use both.
Go back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, I just grab, I don't mind butter. We use a lot of ghee for cooking, actually. And I actually cook eggs in the wok. So there's not a lot of stuff. I mean, it's just really just to lubricate the pan. So, I can do butter. It's obviously low temperature. And, I find you don't have to be real aggressive with cooking eggs. I mean, some people like them more than others.
That's good.
In terms of how they're cooked.
Sure. Yeah. We sometimes, my wife likes to hard boil them. I think I personally don't like them that way, but I do a little olive oil. James DiNicolantonio, have you had him on your podcast?
I had him on the podcast about a month ago.
Okay, cool. With his book Super Fuel, and he was kind of talking about how the hydroxytyrosol and different polyphenols in olive oil help to mitigate some of the oxidation associated with heat in the cooking. So I always like to hear different people's perspectives on.
Yeah, and as you know, I mean, they wrote a book, he with Dr. Mercola, about this, really, and I think it was really well done, giving us a great understanding of the notion of fat, what it means to be actually a healthful fat. But getting back to the meat story, I do believe that there is probably some validity to understanding this whole TMA to TMAO conversion, trimethylamine oxide, in terms of being related to cardiovascular disease, probably relates to brain issues as well. And I think you enhance that process the more meat protein that you're consuming. So I think it makes sense. Did I turn my back on it for personal reasons over the years? To some degree, yeah.
Great point. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the TMAO, and it seems like there are some things going back and forth on that, right? But are we at the point where we can correct this problem? I mean, this problem, meaning so many people are dependent upon fast food. Agriculture is ingrained in our society, and our soils are being infiltrated with Roundup and other pesticides and things like that. Like, do you worry or fear what kind of life your grandchildren are going to be, or how this world will be when they enter this world?
Well, I've had this question posed to me many times, or I've posed it to others, and I've often heard the answer, well, I hope things are going to change. And James Cameron, the movie director, said that hope is not a strategy. It's one thing to hope, but let's do something. And, I'm a believer in lighting the single candle as opposed to cursing the darkness. And to be fair, I maybe curse the darkness a little bit from time to time. But having said that, I think it can be turned around. And I had the opportunity to meet with the largest purveyor of food on planet Earth about a month ago. And we had discussions about what's the right thing to do as you move forward. So I think people are becoming aware of it. This is looking not as much to the stockholders in terms of what you do, as opposed to the shareholders, of which we all are part. Yeah. Whether you own stock in the company or not, we're shareholders in terms of the outcome, in terms of the planet. So it can happen, and I think we often recognize maybe it's darkest before the dawn, and I want to contradict myself and contradict myself and say I'm hopeful, but I'm also acting. Everything that you and I do and other people that do what we do are involved in is trying to move that needle, even if it's a tiny bit. And it's all through education and the recognition that we don't have all the answers and we never will. That's the good news. So therefore, we stay in the game and try to learn as much as we can.
A few final questions here. A lot of people message me on Instagram and say, I've had a lot of antibiotics. I can't tolerate vegetables. How do I reboot my microbiome? Is kind of how they phrase it. I'm sure you've gotten this question before. What do you say to that?
I say that it can happen. It will never, to be straightforward, it won't ever fully happen. There are some indelible changes that happen to the gut bacteria from a single course of antibiotics, much less what we see these days, where people get bombarded. Well, we didn't quite fix the problem. We'll give you another round. And frankly, I can understand in some circumstances why that might be necessary, but I think we all agree that with the CDC, that 70% of the antibiotic prescriptions in America are written for inappropriate reasons. So that's a big number. So having said that, can you reestablish some measure of gut health? Absolutely. I think that amping up your prebiotic fiber is step one, and removing from your exposure those things that might be ongoing in terms of continuing to threaten your gut bacteria. Is your water chlorinated? Are you not sleeping well? Are you not exercising? There's a great correlation between the amount of aerobic exercise you get and the diversity of species that live within you. What is your diet like? Are you using supplemental prebiotic fiber? Are you eating high prebiotic fiber foods? Jicama, dandelion greens, garlic, onions, leeks. Are you recognizing that those are good foods for you? So there's so many things that are involved. Michael Ruscio has a wonderful book about rebuilding your gut, and it's just see so many people out there right now, whether it's skin health or brain health or heart health, everybody's focusing on the gut. Think about it. Think of all these great books that are being written these days. And it's very humbling for a brain specialist moving forward in life to realize the answer's in the gut. Well, I don't own the brain. It's not my territory. I want to own the notion of keeping people healthy and preventing disease moving forward. Not own it, but I want to spend my time in that arena. And that said, the idea that the gut is related in a very big way is, brand new information. It was only just recently released by Dr. Hippocrates. So, we've got to pay attention to the teachings of our elders and realize that, this partitioning of the human body, the Descartes reductionist model of the brain here and the intestines there makes no sense. I mean, we're a fully integrated meta-organism. Along with our organ systems, we have microbes that live within us and upon us that are deeply invested in keeping you healthy because you are their livelihood.
Yeah.
Wow. So when you conceptualize it like that, then you begin to look at every one of your lifestyle choices and think about subtle or dramatic modifications to, based upon what you've learned to regain your health and maintain your health.
Such a great point. So someone like myself, when I exercise, I think it's for my muscles. But when you go for a walk, you're probably thinking, this is for my brain, this is good for my microbes. And then when you eat, are you thinking, what will my microbes want? Or are you thinking, what does David want right now? Like, how does that come into your day-to-day?
Well, I've tried to change my approach to line up with David wants what's best for his microbes.
Nice. That's cool.
And so I've said that to people, women who are pregnant, you say, now you have to be careful because you're eating for two. Well, you're eating for 100 billion. They're going to eat what you eat. They can't order online and have things drop shipped. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So they're going to eat what you eat. And, it goes through your mouth, and pretty soon in your gut, they're going to see, well, what did Mike have today? Is it what I want? Am I happy? Or, oh, this is really threatening. Yeah. And unfortunately, when they have health issues, gut bacteria, they're influencing you. And that's why people can be really sick.
A lot of people, when they transition onto a keto diet, they complain about cravings, like I still crave these carbs. Do you think that's the microbes changing the brain to drive them to eat more carbs?
I think that our brains are really hardwired to look for sweet. That's a deep-seated, it's like sex. It's one of those deep-seated desires that we have because it allowed us to survive. We would seek out sweet food to pave the way for our survival as through the mechanisms we talked about earlier. So I don't know who does not have a sweet tooth, but we override that primitive desire by thinking about what we're talking about today. What are the consequences of consuming sugar? Whether it's changes in the microbiome, glycation of proteins, changes in insulin reactivity, etc. You can look at all those things and say, long-term prefrontal cortex talking here, that's not what's best for me. Or you can say, the heck with that, bring it on. And I'm a dozen Krispy Kremes, whatever it is. And just act from that primitive, non-bridled desire level of your brain. Get that dopamine surge that is never quenched. That only becomes more requiring stimulation as you move forward. As opposed to the serotonin receptors in your brain that don't need more and more with time, that are involved in empathy and prefrontal cortex function. The serotonin 1A receptor to which this neurochemistry, this neurochemical serotonin binds to, the more you stimulate it, it doesn't become less sensitive. It just remains happy. The dopamine receptor, on the other hand, you have these transmission from this dopamine areas that are sensitive through what's called the ventral tegmental area, stimulating parts of the brain that are involved in the production of opiates. So this dopamine surge that we cater to by our buying habits, by our desires to have likes on Facebook, by our food choices, becomes an opiate addiction ultimately.
Wow.
So when we are faced with the opiate crisis, where people are constantly needing to bombard their endogenous opiate receptors, it's absolutely unfair to try to distance them from the notion of them getting there in the first place by what society is doing to that receptor by making us addicted.
That's amazing. And do you think that eating fast food and things like that is triggering that dopamine receptor?
Absolutely.
Do you think people are, because people inherently know that going to McDonald's is bad for them, but they still do it. Is that an addiction?
People do a lot of things that they know inherently is not good for them. And, I think our purpose in life is to call out those activities as being not good for you. That's a game changer right there. Why? Because now I'm aware of it, at least. Now when I do this, at least I know there may be consequences here. It may affect me negatively. Therefore, I should limit my screen time each day. I should maybe not watch blue light screens in the evening. I should make these changes. I should utilize on my smartphone the app that tells me how much time I'm spending, how much screen time am I involved in, is it increasing or decreasing? I should get out, as you mentioned, in nature. I should exercise, do all these things, because I know that the long-term consequences of these choices will be for my own personal betterment and the betterment of others as well.
Great point. Switch cards, yeah. Just help you just make sure. So we just hit pause. Getting darker, slightly.
You have control of the world right there. You must feel empowered.
He's got it all.
Studio lights on a rheostat.
There we go. It's amazing. Well, I'm sure we could talk all day about these different mechanisms and things like that. For folks that have read Grain Brain before, and you got the revised version coming out here more than 5 years later, which is awesome. And I just want to say, in the last 5 years, I mean, the amount of content that you've generated is amazing. So I want to commend you for that, and I have some follow-up questions on that. But anything about the new book that we didn't yet talk about that folks maybe should?
Well, the one question I'm always asked is, what were you wrong about? And I'd love to say, I have no problem with that, but I think maybe we didn't emphasize enough the importance of what the messaging was. But what we've noted is the scientific validation of the last 5 years has been robust, with continued study after study showing higher levels of glycated hemoglobin, A1C, being related to risk for dementia, for example. Studies demonstrating that a measurement of inflammatory markers in people in their 20s and 30s translates to significant increase for brain shrinkage and memory decline 28 years later. Wow. So there's been just an abundance of research that has been able to really validate what our initial messaging was all about. And now that that book is coming out, I'm really looking forward to having these discussions. But we just are preparing another manuscript. You're the first person on interview I've told this to. It is called Brainwash, and that is a book that deals with things that I didn't mean to, but we've been talking about, and that is this change of the human brain wiring based upon these external influences that don't necessarily have our interest. And that'll be January of 2020. So you got the scoop on that.
Oh man, it's amazing. I think, and do you get in that book about the subconscious? Because I think there's so much subconscious programming. So it's funny. So it's like your reaction to something. Do you, let's say you get irritated, someone walks up or something. Is that like, you wonder is that really my thought, or am I responding to how I've been trained from seeing my parents? You know what I mean? It's so.
Yeah, I mean, so what happens in those situations is that you activate these what are called engrams. It lights up a certain part of your brain. It's how the brain works. That's how we learn about whether something is positive, negative, avoidance versus being pulled to doing something. So you're right, but what we're able to do though is take that pause and ask, why did I have that response? And that's what learning is all about. And then when you get that understanding, then you are able to take that information and utilize it, A, to make the appropriate decision now, and B, it helps to tamper that response moving forward through neuroplasticity. So we want to leverage all that we know about that, increasing BDNF through dietary issues, through raising beta-hydroxybutyrate through ketogenic diet, through exercise, etc., and allow those new pathways that you've just developed, this new understanding, to really be much more indelible or take root.
That's amazing. When you're brushing your teeth, I mean, there's different ways to induce novelty. Do you like to use like your opposite hand instead?
It's funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
I'll get back to that in a second, but what I'm really, this book's about connecting. It's connecting to your genome, connecting to your microbiome, connecting to your neighbor, connecting to your community. And I'm writing this with Austin Perlmutter, MD, our son. And he's been away in his residency in internal medicine. So we are connecting to write this book. And it's just been,
it's awesome.
Been a terrific experience for a guy like me, for your son to say, yeah, Dad, I'll write a book with you. Guys, it's great. This summer, my wife and I went kayaking. We got in a current and got a little bit caught in the current. We really had to work for a bit to get out of it. And everything was fine. About 2 days later, I had incredible tendonitis of my thumb, on of course, my right hand. And I couldn't brush my teeth. So I had to use my left hand. And I couldn't do it. I had to hold the toothbrush and move my head up and down. I'm not joking. That's what I did. So anyway.
So, but
after, it's very important.
After a week or so, you probably were adapting.
Isn't that amazing?
Neurons.
How the brain works. Yeah. Right. Neuroplasticity at its best.
One of my favorite books that it was called Brain Gate. It came out in like 2001. It was all about the blood-brain barrier and novelty. And at that point, I was trying to learn as much as I could, studying, biology and biochemistry. And so I'd always do these like weird tricks to like enhance BDNF and so forth. And that was one of them that came in there.
Well, we're all about that, as we move forward. About hey, pick up a pad and pencil and sketch something. Write a poem. Learn a musical instrument. Learn a new language. I mean, people have talked about these things, and it's not just from the novelty perspective, which is hugely important, but it's also from the creativity perspective. People need to re-tap into that early life sense of awe and creativity that is so important for reestablishing connection to those parts of the brain that have been dormant, but they're still available to you.
Such a key point. That's awesome. So book bonuses, things like that. Do you guys have probably a landing page for Grain Brain Revised, or should they just go to your website if they want to learn more about?
That's right. Website, drperlmutter.com. And for your people, we have a link to a ketogenic guide, which I think people really like, and a glycemic index book as well that everybody can have.
Perfect. So I'll put that in the show notes and then below. And then a few kind of personal questions as we kind of part ways here. A lot of folks that listen to our podcast are, entrepreneurs, business owners, and also healthcare practitioners themselves, nutritionists and things like that. And prior to Grain Brain, you've written several books, right? And some did great, some not so great, but Grain Brain blew it out of the park, right? How did you have that tenacity to just keep going and keep getting the message out there?
Well, I've always really admired the work of Thomas Edison, not for his successes, but for his failures. And his failures, he was quite open about, were his best self-teaching tools. And he always said, I learned more from my 99 failures than my one success. And I think it is important that people learn from each lesson. And I don't want to characterize those books as failures, because early on in life, the first two books, I actually wrote them, typed them, on a word processor at the time, and then they were self-published. I had a printer, and I used them as teaching tools in my office. And it's staying with it, having a belief that it's important work, and whether they sold 10 copies or 1 million copies, if 10 people read that book and learned something, that's success for me. That is doing the work. And beyond that, in terms of as it relates to the book is the best teaching tool for you as the author that you will ever have. It is really a very important. So whether if anybody buys it or 1 million people buy it, the fact is writing that book and reviewing the literature and making sure you know that literature, so when Mike Mutzel comes to your house and wants to interview you, have something to say, is a really good thing for you in terms of your knowledge base and in terms of your ability to support your positions. I was about to use the word defend, but that sort of set it up as confrontational. So to be supportive of what you are speaking about.
That's a wonderful point. A lot of people in your shoes that have multiple great best-selling books, New York Times best-selling books, and so forth.
By the way, we're not wearing shoes.
Yeah, which
right?
is
We're barefoot here, so
we're just hanging out, just chatting. Feel a sense of calling, like they're put on this earth to do something. Do you have that? Because writing books, I mean, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of fortitude, doing the research, fact checking, references, all that, right? And you've cranked out so much great content. Do you feel like, man, I have this calling to and I have this gift to disseminate the message? Do you have that?
At the risk of sounding bombastic with reference to myself, that is a skill that I have. I don't play ping pong very well. I don't dive off high dives well at all. But I have an ability, I know, to take information and make it understandable for people. That's the ability I have, so I'm trying to hone that and utilize it throughout my lifetime. And I think it's a very important thing to do as well, because one-on-one with patients, it is one-on-one, or maybe they're family members. But when you write a book that's translated into 34 languages, I'm touching people with that book around the world who I will never even see. And for them to get the message that, hey, stop the sugar, gluten might be an issue for you, you should exercise and pay attention to how well you're sleeping. Just those points alone, it covers a lot of territory, and as I said earlier, maybe that'll move the needle a tiny bit, and that's what we're here for.
That's amazing. And if there was just one habit that contributes to your success the most, meditation, exercise, hugging someone you care about, and that's the only cool thing that you could do to improve the function of Dr. Perlmutter's brain, what would that habit be, would you say?
I would say that it would be the continued experience of and utilization of, or using gratitude in my life. Experience gratitude for my family members, for the gifts that I've been given, and so the expression of that gratitude is utilizing those gifts and giving back. So that's the overriding, I think, message.
That's awesome. And you implement that on a daily basis, just thinking like right when you wake up, I'm so grateful that I'm alive, that I'm here, I have this great house, this life. Like, is there any practical ways? Because some people wake up and they have bills to pay, their credit card debt and all that. Like,
everybody has bills to pay, but if there is, I'll tell you an interesting experience I had.
Sure.
My closest friend, I was called to the emergency room to see him, and he is the man who had married my wife and me, really close friend of the family. I went to the emergency room, and he was essentially, he was brain dead at that point. And the family members came in, and it took about 12 hours until we could take him off of life support. This happened a few years ago. So I had to process all of that as a neurologist, doing the right things, calling the people in, taking him off of life support, and I never fully processed it as the loss that it was. The next day I didn't feel well, and ultimately I just became very, very sick. So sick that I couldn't stand. And ultimately, my wife said, "You don't look good. I'm going to take you to the hospital." I don't want to go to the hospital, no matter what. Yeah. And I said to her, "I don't think I'll make it. I think you need to call 911. So here I am, being very open about this. Yeah. Next thing you know, an ambulance arrived, came right up that driveway, and I couldn't get from the couch to the wheelchair. They had to pick me up. So I was in florid atrial fibrillation with a very high heart rate, and they put me in the intensive care unit, and we were just in another intensive care unit just dealing with my friend's death. And so they gave me some medication to break the atrial fibrillation, and I have a good heart, I was told. I learned after the fact. But so I was in the intensive care unit, and throughout the night I was doing better and better, and ultimately they took out the IVs and everything. By the time the cardiologist came into the unit to examine me, I was doing yoga, no IVs, I'm on the floor doing yoga. So that afternoon we went to, oddly enough, a yoga class, and in that yoga class the instructor said, "It doesn't matter what you contribute, even if it's picking up a piece of paper off the floor. That's how you demonstrate your gratitude." So I think that's, no matter what you do, sure you have bills to pay, sure you have obligations, sure you can be caught up in your day-to-day life, But there is something in each and every day that you can do, that each of us can do, to demonstrate how grateful we are for the good stuff, for just being alive today. It's a great time to be alive.
Oh my
Despite
gosh.
all the negativity that surrounds us, it really is, and we've got to demonstrate that gratitude. So I said to you earlier about actions. So when we demonstrate, when we have actions that are involved in demonstration of our gratitude, that is self-serving. Why? Because it's going to change your brain. Because you did something. It's going to help rewire your brain to make you more empathetic and more understanding and more able to plan for the future, improving your executive function. So in a sense, it's self-serving, but it's definitely the right thing to do.
It's amazing. Yeah, just when you give gratitude or do something, a kind thing for another person, it makes your day so much better. We always focus on like, I want to buy this, I got to save up for this vacation or this, but when you just give back, it's like amazing how it comes back to you. And
there's a saying that teaching a kid not to step on a caterpillar is as important for the kid as it is for the caterpillar.
Yeah, love that saying.
And it's giving without needing the return. It's putting the dollar in the tip cup when the guy who's making your coffee isn't looking. Different,
wonderful.
right?
Yeah. I've had a situation like that where I can't remember what, it was like a Whole Foods or something, and they didn't charge me for, I think it was like a can of coconut oil. I was traveling, and I went back, and they were like, well, why are you here paying for it? It's like, well, you didn't charge me for it. And anyway, they were like, the clerk was like, okay, well, I'll charge you, but you basically had it for free, dude. Why would you come back here?
You basically have to carry that karma of...
Yeah. Interesting. Well, speaking of gratitude, I have a moment of gratitude for you, because back in 2014, when I wrote Self-Published Belly Fat Effect, I sent a copy to you, I think a PDF of some sort, and I was just like hoping and praying. I was like, I wonder if he'll get back to me on the forward. And right before, it was like 2 days before we were going to publish, you wrote the forward for that book. And I was like, you know what? He didn't have to do that. And so I'm really grateful for that opportunity.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. All right. So really appreciate all these conversations that we've had. I'll put them on the show notes as well. And you're found all over social media, drperlmutter.com.
Right.
And the book comes out the 18th of December.
18th of December.
So by the
2
time...
weeks from today.
On a Tuesday.
Always.
Yeah, what's up with that?
You know, I like being limber and dynamic, and just making a change for change's sake. There's a lot of positive results associated with that.
Interesting. Yeah, I asked someone that before who was in the music industry, and records come out on a certain, I can't remember what day it was, like a Friday or Thursday. But anyway, I always wondered why the Tuesday thing, but...
Yeah.
Because
it probably dates back to the ancient Phoenicians who knows.
It's crazy. Dr. P, really appreciate you coming on the show. It's always great to speak with you. And folks, I'm sure you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please hit that like button. Share this with someone in your close inner circle of friends, family, and leave a comment below. We do check those comments. I'd love to hear your perspective, and definitely go out and check out the book. And the bonuses for you are in the show notes as well. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.